People say, and they ask me, why would you go from a profession that's well respected, being a physician, to one of the least respected professions? And I ask myself the same question sometimes. But part of the answer is I got tired of throwing things at my TV, basically. I would watch the evening news and throw whatever I had in my hand at my TV and say, who elected these people? How did these people get to Washington? They don't represent me. And in fact, some of my anger was actually towards Republicans that had been elected. I've always been a Republican, but we had 8 years of a Republican, and the debt went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Now we've had 2 terms of a Democrat president, but the Republicans bear some of the blame as well. They were in charge of the House for much of this time. The debt's gone from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. We borrow $1 million every minute. Think about it, $1 million every minute. We're nearly at $19 trillion in total debt, and I'm worried that we could destroy the country at this rate, or destroy the currency paying for this. And I think, well, whose fault is it? Which party's at fault? Both parties, probably. And that's really why I'm running for office, is that I don't think anybody else really is going to do anything about it. In fact, we just had a big battle, and I think I'm maybe the most unpopular person in Washington. I kept my colleagues up till 3 in the morning haranguing them because they were raising the debt ceiling yet again. And you know who was the impetus for raising the debt ceiling? The right and the left. The right said we've got to have more money for military spending. The left said we've got to have more money for welfare. And you know what they did? An unholy alliance. They got together and they raised both. Everybody was complaining about the sequester in Washington. You know what the sequester was? It was a slowdown in the rate of growth of spending. Spending still was going up under the sequester, but you wouldn't know it for all the complaining in Washington from the right and the left. And this is the problem. This is why we're bankrupt. It isn't just the Democrats. It's the Democrats and the Republicans. It's the right and the left. And you might say, well, gosh, we've got to have a strong national defense. I couldn't agree more. I think it's the most important thing we do is a strong national defense. It's the #1 priority of the government. And yet, I don't think we're stronger from bankruptcy court. I don't think we project strength as we become more and more bankrupt as a country. And you say, well, we're not spending enough on the military. Well, I don't know. You got to put it in perspective. We spend $600 billion defending our country. How much is that? Well, it's more than Russia and China combined and 8 more countries. So the question is, if we spent $700 or $800 billion, like some of the candidates are proposing, are we going to be stronger, or are we going to be further in debt? If we are the fiscally conservative party, if you're a Republican because you say I'm for balanced budgets, you can't be for unlimited spending for anything. We have to have limits. We should audit not only the Fed, but we should audit the Pentagon. You know what the Pentagon says? We're too big to be audited. Wow. We should audit all of government. We should know where the money's being spent. We shouldn't have $1,000 hammers, $1,000 toilet seats. We shouldn't have just unlimited spending where the waste goes through the roof. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Afghanistan last year, we spent $43 million on a natural gas station. They've estimated that the cost would be, in real terms, about $500,000. But here's the problem. Not only was it like 100 times more expensive than it should have been, how many natural gas cars do you think there are in Afghanistan? Think of global warming deal. Yeah, exactly. It's just green stuff, and it's throughout the Defense Department. Go visit a military base anywhere in the world, and half of their job is, because you know what the president says, a bigger threat to us is global warming. It's a bigger threat than terrorism. Global warming. And so in the embassy, their stories just run without end. But remember the whole deal in Benghazi? They asked for a plane to be able to fly around about 6 months before it happened. Hillary Clinton denied it. But you know what Hillary Clinton had time to approve? She approved $100,000 for an electrical charging station for Chevy Volts for the Vienna embassy. So we've got money to pretend like we're as green as the Europeans and as crazy as the Europeans are in this stuff, but we don't have enough money for the basic necessities to fly our people around in a hostile war situation. All throughout that Benghazi thing, and to me it's not about the spin afterwards, it's not about whether it was about a movie. Of course they lied about that. They're politicians, expect them to lie. But what it's about when we're talking about who should be the commander-in-chief, for 6 months leading up to Benghazi, they begged for more security. In June of that year, she let a 6-man Special Forces team go home. In July, they let another 6-man Special Forces team go home. In August, a 16-person security team went home. So right after another. And you know who was defending them? The February 17th militia. Good luck with that. One of them was taking pictures that morning, and they all fled when the attackers came. Hillary Clinton's inaction is inexcusable. Her dereliction of duty should forever preclude her from being Commander-in-Chief.
Criminal.
But the problem of government is that we spend money we don't have. Right. So what you have is a $19 trillion deficit, but you got people in both parties clamoring for more money, and that's the problem. So I kept them up till 3 in the morning haranguing them over this because they're busting the budget caps for both military and for domestic spending. And it's just literally out of control. The other problem in Washington is all the spending bills are crammed into one bill. They call it an omnibus or a continuing resolution. We don't pass the individual spending bills. And so what happens? Nothing gets reformed. So the $43 million gas station that was spent from the military budget never gets fixed because there is not an individual bill to say we're no longer going to do this. We spent $800,000 in Afghanistan developing a televised cricket league. $800,000 for a televised cricket league. They don't even have televisions in Afghanistan. All right? But that's not a proper use of our money. Plus, we don't have it. We got to borrow it from China to spend it in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. We spent $250,000 last year in Pakistan to bring 24 Pakistani kids to the U.S. to send them to space camp in Alabama. Well, I know a lot of kids in our country can't go to space camp in Alabama. Where do we have the money to spend on foreign kids to go to space camp? We spent $15 million on community college for foreign students. We do not have the money to do this. We can't borrow money from China to pay the community college tuition for somebody from Pakistan. It doesn't make any sense. But this is what's going on with your government because we lump all the spending together and then they come and they say, well, government's going to shut down, or if we keep government open, we just have to vote for everything. And I think it's a false choice. In fact, I think it's more of a danger to the country to keep it open and continue to borrow $1 million a minute than it is just to let it all expire and then let's have a debate over what we really should spend money on. I mean, the list goes on and on. We spent a couple $100,000 last year studying whether or not Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. Yeah. I'm guessing we could have just polled the audience on that one, you know? Could have saved a couple $100,000. But this kind of stuff is rife throughout government, and it never goes away. Because these waste projects, we can look up every year. The last 2 decades, I can give you, dozens and dozens of things we're spending money on that we shouldn't. So we had a vote yesterday, and this was a big deal. It was on repealing Obamacare. So the good news is, from my perspective, we repealed Obamacare. Bad news is, President Obama's still in the White House, and he's going to veto it. Right. We also had some important votes, and I had 2 amendments on the bill. I think we do have to defend ourselves against people who come here to attack us. I think one way we should defend ourselves is by screening those who come into the country. I don't think we have a clue who's coming into the country. We have 150,000 students from the Middle East right now here. We have 750,000 people from the Middle East who came in the last 5 years. Do we know that they're obeying the rules of the immigration system? I don't know. We have 11 million people in the country illegally. 40% of them overstayed their visa. Do we know all the people visiting here from the Middle East are not overstaying their visa and are obeying our rules? I don't know. One or two of the hijackers on 9/11 were here on student visas. They weren't obeying our rules and had overstayed their visa. The Boston bombers came here for asylum and were given free food, free housing, free college, and then chose to kill us. In my hometown, Bowling Green, Kentucky, we had 2 Iraqi refugees who came here under the refugee program. Everybody said, the president says they're no risk, they're refugees. Well, we didn't screen them, and they tried to buy Stinger missiles in my town, and we caught them. But when we caught them and looked at their background, it turns out one of them's fingerprints were already on a bomb fragment from Iraq. We're not doing a good enough job screening people. So I introduced an amendment yesterday to say, look, let's slow down here. Let's make sure we know who's here and who's coming. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars defending our country, and yet we're not even aware of who's coming and going in our country. Unfortunately, this failed, and one of my main opponents on this was Rubio, who says he's For spending billions more dollars, he wants our troops to go back to the Middle East, but he's not for defending the borders and not for knowing who's coming here. So we have to decide what we're going to do to defend ourselves. One of the other ways we ultimately have to defend ourselves is through self-defense. Now, District of Columbia is the most anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment place in the whole country. But the District of Columbia police chief said last week, she said, if you see an armed assailant, the public should take them down. And I said, well, yeah, that sounds like good advice if I could buy a gun in D.C. or carry it, which I'm not allowed to. So I introduced a bill. The District of Columbia is under special provisions from the Constitution, is under the authority of Congress. We make the rules for the District of Columbia. So I introduced a bill to the budget last night that would have allowed a concealed carry, national reciprocity for concealed carry, and would have allowed our soldiers to have weapons on the base. I think one of the dumbest things we do in our country is your soldiers who know how to use their weapons, who we send overseas to war, we won't let them carry their weapon on their base. When that Major Hassan was on the base in Texas, killing like 15 people, if most of the soldiers would have been armed, somebody might have taken him down earlier. We had the shooting at the ROTC offices recently. They all should be allowed to carry guns. Our pilots should carry guns. Do you know how many pilots? It's supposed to be classified, but you can look it up on the internet. It's a small number of our pilots are now armed. We should make an announcement to the world that all of our pilots are armed and you come in the cockpit at your own peril. But it's just like every other government program. And people ask me all the time, is government inherently stupid? It's like, well, maybe no, but it's a debatable question at the very least. But on arming our pilots, they opposed it after 9/11. We finally passed it and we allowed it to happen. But they set up a government program. They said you had to take a 5-day training course if you're a pilot in New Mexico. The only place in the country you could take it. So you had to take 5 days of work off and fly to New Mexico at your own dime to get the permit. And then they said you had to have shooting practice. Well, that sounds reasonable, except for you couldn't do the shooting practice if you were a pilot in Mason City. You couldn't do it here. You had to travel to Chicago or someplace to do your shooting practice every 6 months. So the pilots, and I see them all the time because I'm in the airports, they say, we want to carry a gun, we want to have a gun in the cockpit, but we can't because they've made the requirements, just insane. So we have all these government officials in New Mexico. I said, why don't we put them on a plane and do 5 regional conferences a year in different cities so the pilots can do their training, and then why don't we let them shoot their gun for practice wherever they live and have the local person inside and say he came in or she came in and shot their weapon. But government is just so full of problems like this. But I think deterrence does help. People who want to kill us should know that we're armed. Where are the crazy people going to shoot people? To places like this where you're not allowed to have a weapon, where it's basically printed on the window defenseless, that nobody will have a gun here, and so crazy people go where there are no guns to shoot people. We have a government that is lacking in common sense and bankrupting us. I am unique among all of the candidates in that I would balance the budget. Not just vote for a balanced budget amendment, I've actually introduced budgets that actually balance. And this is where you separate those who are real believers and honest and those who are really not. Every Republican in Washington will vote for a balanced budget amendment, but put forward a budget that balances, and very few of them will vote for it because it cuts things. Mine gets rid of the Department of Education. I don't think we need a federal Department of Education. I get rid of all corporate welfare. I get rid of the Department of Commerce. I get rid of several departments. It's the only way you'd ever balance a budget. There's barely enough in the budget to spend on the things that we've actually promised, like Social Security and Medicare and veterans and soldiers and interest on the debt. That consumes almost all the money that comes in. But it's an enormous amount of money that comes in. $3 trillion comes in. So when people say, oh, you're just for so small a government, there'd be no government. Well, I'm really for just spending what comes in. $3 trillion is still an enormous amount of money. You think we could get by on $3 trillion? But no, we bring in $3 trillion and we spend $3.8 trillion. I could go on, but I'd really rather hear some of your questions and have a little more dialogue. So why don't we take some questions? Yes.
Well, I have a son serving in the Navy. I mentioned to you the last time your dad was by. I got a good photograph of you with the picture of the submarine. He signed it and all with your father. But anyway, we see all these pictures of all these young men coming in as refugees. Once upon a time, I actually received a draft card at the end of the line there. But why don't we draft these fighting-age men that's coming in as refugees, take them back, train them to take back their own country? Draft them.
I haven't thought about it. I have a nephew in the Navy also, flies the P-3, and I have 2 that are enlisted. So we have a lot of members of my family in the military too, so I understand how important it is. I do think that there is some argument for that. And for example, I have a great deal of sympathy. My church brought in somebody, a family from Bosnia, so I'm not without a heart as far as trying to help people who are hurting. But at the same time, after the Iraq War, which supposedly we won, if you win a war, why would people come here seeking asylum? The Vietnam War, the people who fought with the South Vietnamese army with us would have been slaughtered if we left them. So I think it was a good thing that we let them come seeking asylum. But we won the Iraq War. Why would 70,000 Iraqis need to come over after we won the war? In fact, if they're pro-Western, they would have been the best people to actually stay. And if any of them were trained militarily, you're right, they would have been the best people to stay there. The other question to ask about the refugee problem is, Saudi Arabia, and we shouldn't forget that 16 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia has poured 600 tons of weapons into the Syrian civil war. We're part of that too, and so has Qatar. So they fanned the flames of that Syrian civil war because they're Sunni and they don't like Assad, who's a Shiite. However, now that all those refugees are dislodged from that war, how many refugees are Saudi Arabia taking?
None.
0.
And they got a tent city there that could take millions.
Probably air-conditioned tent city.
Yes.
But Saudi Arabia's taking 0. Iran has put troops and money in on the other side. They are for the Baghdad government, which is Shiite, and for Assad, who's a Shiite as well. Have they taken any refugees? 0. Qatar is a small country, but very, very rich, and they buy and sell arms from us, and those arms get plowed into there. Many of those arms wound up in the hands of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and sympathizers. Has Qatar taken any? No. Bahrain? No. Oman? No. United Arab Emirates? No. None of these countries that live over there have taken any refugees. So what we would tell them, and if I were in charge, I would say, look, you're not getting any more arms from us. I'm not going to sell you any arms until I see you taking refugees and taking responsibility for your behavior. Saudi Arabia has throughout the world promoted a radical form of Islam that hates Americans and hates our way of life and thinks that it's okay to kill civilians. And Saudi Arabia needs to quit doing it. And there's still 28 missing pages on the 9/11 report that I've read that talks about Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11. And I can't tell you the details of it, but I've been promoting legislation that everybody ought to be able to read it. In Saudi Arabia, if they've gotten wealthy off of us, off of trading with us, they need to behave, and they need to be part of the solution, not the problem. Anybody else? Yes.
Changing the subject, what's your stand on ethanol?
Okay. Questions on ethanol. Can you imagine coming to Iowa and getting a question on ethanol?
Hey, I'm wearing flyers, so you better talk right. I'm a farmer.
The way I look at it is, we look at something the way it exists, and we say, how can we make things better? So we have a significant ethanol, corn / industry in Iowa. We have some in Kentucky as well. And so when I've visited with my farmers in Kentucky and sat down with them, I've said, and asked them questions to try to figure out, is there anything the government can do to get out of the way to allow your industry to grow? So I asked the same thing to my farmers and to those who make ethanol and the co-ops. I asked the same thing to them that I would ask to Toyota or any other business that's in my state. What can I do to get the government out of your way? And so I thought about this, and I talked with them, and I came up with an idea, and I went to Chuck Grassley with it. My idea was, are there any government regulations that are hurting the sale of ethanol? And apparently there's one that's very big, and so he and I have a bill together to repeal that. There's an EPA regulation called the volatility rule. And what it says is that it is illegal, basically, from the EPA's point of view, to sell any ethanol greater than 10% in the summertime. And there may be some logic behind it, but nobody believes that we couldn't get rid of this rule. If you did, and the marketplace developed, maybe we'd be having E20 or E50 or E70 being sold to a greater degree. If you did, then you wouldn't need the mandate so much. So the argument is always over mandate, no mandate, how much is mandated. I don't like government mandates. I don't like the government telling people exactly what they have to do in any business. And that may or may not be popular in Iowa, but I do have consideration for business, and I want your business to thrive the same way I want my business and farmers to thrive in Kentucky. So my bill would get rid of the volatility rule and tell the EPA that they can't limit it. Then I think we'd have ethanol sold year-round that might be at a higher percentage. The goal would be that so much ethanol would be produced and sold that you wouldn't need to mandate anymore. That scares some people, but at the same time, then you'd have a real marketplace and you'd get to the point. Ultimately, I think that's the direction over time it's going to head towards anyway. So let's try to get the government out of the way to allow more production. The other thing our bill does is there's something called CAFE standards. Car companies have to increase the miles per gallon to their cars over time. It's been there for, 20 years, 30 years. And it's getting harder and harder to do. It's getting to where the car manufacturers have to be like 55 miles per gallon eventually over the next 10 years. One way they can meet that regulation is by also making alternative fuel cars that burn either ethanol, natural gas, butane, something else, alternative fuels. And our bill also would make that ability to meet that regulation, would make it a permanent thing and would enhance that. So those are two ways we could help, but they're not necessarily talking about the mandate. My hope is to get deregulation enough that you wouldn't need the mandate. Anybody else? Yes.
So I'm a German exchange student and the correspondent by the Alt Exchange, so I'm a little bit more interested in your foreign policy. How would you deal in general with the relationship to Europe regarding the refugee crisis or TTIP?
Right. I think Germany's got the problem we have, but on steroids. I mean, you guys have an enormous problem you're going to have. Here's the problem. It's one thing to have a big heart, but you got to have a brain to go along with a big heart. And Europe has this huge heart, so does Germany, saying, everybody come to Germany. The problem is, there was a guy in the newspaper, there's a bunch of these, but one of them struck me. He was a 19-year-old man coming in through the refugee wave. He had one name, and he was from Afghanistan. He wasn't from Syria. And he was with a piece of paper he got issued in Hungary. And it's like, really? You really think you're going to be certain he's not going to come and attack? Germany's had its problems with, and so has Belgium got the problem. Now France has the problems. I don't envy, I don't know what the answer is, but I do not envy Europe with having to figure out how to sort through these problems. Now France has taken the approach to just search through everybody's information. So the problems we have, or that some of us don't like about collecting all the Americans' phone records, France is doing that on steroids, and yet it didn't stop the attack. So I don't think you can give up your liberty to get security. I think you give up your liberty to get a false sense of security, and you're still at risk. But there are some common sense things that all countries should do, and I don't think they're mean-spirited, but I think we need to know who's coming to visit, who's coming to study, and I think we need to know who wants to move here. And there needs to be some rules about that. We can't just have a wide-open border. But I think Germany's showing a big heart, but I don't know if they're having a lot of forethought towards what's going to happen when they have hundreds of thousands of new people coming in. Anybody else? Back here?
So I'm a physician too, and you're a physician. And I listen to these debates, and there's a guy on stage who thinks vaccines cause autism. Nobody contradicts him. There's another guy on stage who thinks he's going to cure cancer to save money in his first term. Nobody contradicts him. The other physician on stage believes the pyramids were made to store weed. I mean, to me, this is your chance to lead. So aside from, getting rid of Obamacare, what do you think about medicine?
I've been in practice for about 20 years, and the main complaint that I got from patients who came in was cost. That the cost of insurance was rising rapidly, and it was difficult for people who either own businesses or for employees, frankly, that were having to bear more of the cost of insurance. So the number one complaint I got was cost. I don't think anything we did with the Affordable Care Act addressed cost. It addressed access. So we have more access to insurance now. So we've got free, we've got subsidized, and then we have a shrinking pool of payers. The shrinking pool of payers, though, inevitably are going to pay higher prices because they're having to pay for the subsidized and the free. And so what's going to happen, and what is happening, is the shrinking pool of those who buy their insurance are going to pay more. They're going to have less choices. And the main thing I believe when we're talking about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare is to understand you have less choice for your physician, and you're also going to have less choice to buy inexpensive insurance. In fact, it's illegal in our country now to buy inexpensive insurance. What do I mean by that? I have 3 kids, and I'm married, so there's 5 of us. For nearly a decade, I bought insurance that had a $5,000 deductible and didn't cover anything under $5,000. You say, oh, you're rich, you're a doctor. You know what I spent? Between $3,000 and $5,000 a year for my family. Do you know what that policy costs now? $25,000. Why? Because President Obama doesn't think we're smart enough to make decisions. He mandated 10 different items that were underneath the $5,000 and have to be covered from $1. What does that mean? He made it not a high deductible policy. He made it a first dollar policy with all these mandates. Well, if I'm a 22-year-old single male kid, I don't need pregnancy coverage. In fact, it's probably a perverse incentive to give me pregnancy coverage. If I'm a 75-year-old widowed woman or married woman, I don't need pregnancy coverage, but I can get my insurance a little cheaper if it doesn't have pregnancy coverage. My son's 20. One of my sons, when he was 22, they mandated his pediatric dental, and I'm like, well, at least he'll have dental coverage. No, it's for his kids. He doesn't need an incentive to have kids. But it's a mandate, and it costs money. So all this stuff, the only people getting rich are the insurance companies. They're all getting rich off of these mandates. Everybody's forced to buy insurance, and the insurance companies get rich. What I would do is the first thing you have to recognize is that this is not a health problem. It's an economic problem. This is how you distribute a good or a service. And so you have to ask yourself, who does it better, the United States or Cuba? Do you want the Cuban model or do you want the free market model? Now, medicine before Obamacare wasn't a free market model. Half of what I did, probably half of what you do, is already the government, Medicaid and Medicare. That's already the government. But realize it has its problems. All the prices are set. They're set by sort of like the Politburo. The Centers for Medical Service, CMS, sets the prices. So if you're just out of school, and I've been out of school 20 years, we charge the same price because Medicare sets the prices. Without price competition, the prices go up, and there's a shortage or waiting time or rationed by length of time you wait. The bottom line is you have to decide what economic system works best. In my practice, there were two things when the price came down every year. They were not covered by insurance. LASIK surgery and contact lenses. LASIK surgery, because it's not covered by insurance, every doctor will tell you the price the moment they pick up the phone. Whoever answers the phone in the doctor's office, and in fact, the average patient who wants to get rid of their glasses and have LASIK surgery calls 4 doctors. The first thing they ask is price. They want to know if you're good, and they find out kind of indirectly from your friends and your reputation. They also ask the price. Try calling a doctor in Mason City and saying, what's the price to have my gallbladder out? Nobody has a clue. And nobody cares, and nobody ever calls that out because your insurance covers the gallbladder. To get people to care about prices, they have to pay. People say, I don't want to pay. That's the whole conundrum. The conundrum is really what you need is everybody paying. If everybody were able to save and have higher deductibles, and everybody has differing levels on how high deductibles they can get, but let's say 50% of America had a $2,000 deductible. But let's say 40% of America had a $4,000. 20% of America had a $10,000 deductible. Then it's a marketplace. And then if you're brand new out of school and I've been out 20 years, I might go charge $150 for my exam. And if you're new and you want some of my business, you might charge $75. Then you get a real marketplace. Contact lenses the same way. I charge almost exactly the same as Walmart, within $1 or $2, because that was about what the market would bear. They would go to Walmart versus me if I wasn't competitive. But that's a real marketplace. Capitalism works. And we had a fork in the road. We had an imperfect system. We went with government instead of with more capitalism. So you need more health savings accounts, more competition, sale of insurance across state lines, less mandates, more freedom. And you have to realize that when you want something for free, when government does it, free takes away your choices. So socialism is the absence of choice when government does things. So we just need more of a marketplace. And it's foreign because we've been coddled into thinking insurance is part of employment and it's always somebody else's responsibility. And think about it. The one thing about people, they'll come into your office and they'll have a pack of cigarettes and a 6-pack of beer in their house, but they won't pay $5 copay sometimes in the office because we've downgraded what we think medicine is worth. So the bottom line is it is about economics. So you got to choose more capitalism. Then you got the wrong guy in the White House and still a lot of the wrong people in Congress as well. And I hope we don't break it completely before we do something going in the opposite direction. I got time for a couple more? Yes.
The current president has used his executive powers, executive orders more than anybody probably in history. And some of the executive orders that he's issued are directly in conflict with existing rules and regulations. Should there be a way to regulate what the president can and cannot do through executive power?
Yes. And that's one of the biggest problems we face is the growth of executive power. We're supposed to have co-equal branches of government, But if I were to estimate the lopsided nature of how much power has gone to the White House, I'd say it's 1,000-fold more powerful than Congress now. Most of the onerous regulations that are out there, I never get to vote on them. They're being written by the White House. I have a bill called the REINS Act that says if the White House writes a regulation and it's going to affect a broad part of the economy and have a significant economic impact, it would have to come back to Congress and be voted on like a law. Our founding fathers wouldn't recognize the place because they never intended to have the president writing law. In fact, one of the philosophers our founding fathers looked towards was Montesquieu. And Montesquieu said that when the executive begins to legislate, a form of tyranny will ensue. That's kind of what's going on now. But I wouldn't blame just Obama. He's taken it to another degree, but it's been going on since Woodrow Wilson. It's been going on for 100 years. We just keep letting it slip away. It's partly Congress's fault for giving up the power, but it's partly the fault of having presidents that keep grabbing more and more power. But we got to have more congressional oversight, and we should be fighting him when we're not. I don't think we're even now, we, the Republicans control the House and the Senate, I don't think we are adequately utilizing our power or leverage that we should. We should be fighting him more. And but we need a more equal distribution of power, and it is a real problem.
Can those executive orders be repealed, or?
A new president can. Any executive order that's done by executive order can be repealed by executive order. And if I were president, I'd repeal virtually everything this president's done on day one, maybe everything. I'd have to look at all of them. But most of them have been bad for the economy. But I'd go further back. I mean, we've had a lot of bad executive orders from the previous president, who was a Republican, the previous president, who was a Democrat, the previous president, who was a Republican. Enormous things have been done. The first George Bush put out a manual changing the definition of wetlands. By changing the definition, he doubled overnight the amount of wetlands in the country. I'm all for protecting the Everglades, the Des Moines River. I want the government to be involved with protecting the environment. But I don't want the definition of wetland to be so loose that everybody's backyard and everybody's farm is a wetland. Because I don't want the federal government traipsing around all our land driving us crazy. Because they also consider putting dirt on your land to be a felony and to be enough to be in prison. One man in southern Mississippi was in prison for 10 years for a RICO violation, conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act, and all he did was put dirt on his land. So we've got to be very wary of a government run amok. One more. Yes.
Is there anything that can be done? Your dad passed a bill regarding the Federal Reserve to audit it,
Right.
expose it, do away with it, and get our country back on the constitutional money system again?
I'm the lead sponsor of that bill in the Senate, and it was a great bill. He worked on it for many years.
Right.
When he finally got a consensus, he got every Republican and 100 Democrats in the House to pass it. Now it's in the Senate, and the Federal Reserve is full-time lobbying against it. In fact, I introduced legislation 2 weeks ago to make it illegal for the Federal Reserve to lobby against it. Why? Because they're a creation of Congress. They're a creation of government. Why in the world would we let them have the power to lobby against us looking at their books?
Right.
So I have an audit the Fed bill, the same one my dad had, and I have about 35 co-sponsors. I've been promised a vote. I fought with Harry Reid for 4 years to get a vote, never got one, even though he used to be for auditing the Fed.
Right.
I'm trying to get the Republican leadership. I've been promised a vote. It has not yet occurred, and I'm going to keep pushing them to get a vote on this.
But isn't that the fact? I mean, your dad's bill, that proves that we can't balance the budget unless we audit that Fed, because they're slipping out money to foreign countries, foreign corporations, all that. I mean, we'll never balance that budget unless we get that audit.
And they're sort of chicken and the egg also. When you run a massive deficit, how do they pay for it? With the Fed printing up the money. So you can't run, if we did not have the Fed, we wouldn't have massive deficits, and vice versa. You know, they are chicken and the egg, but we've got to audit them at the very first step. But then we also need to make sure the public knows that huge housing boom we had in 2007 was created by the Federal Reserve. So it's a huge correction also came from the Federal Reserve, and they are culpable. We need to audit them, and we can't have them come into Congress using all the power of that monopoly of money system to lobby against us looking at their books. That offends me about as much as anything. I'm going to keep fighting the battle, though. Thanks, everybody.